My screaming may have saved my life. Some context first, this story took place in 2020, when I was 18 years old. I lived in a relatively safe neighborhood, but my country does have a high crime rate in general, so take that with a pinch of salt. My dad had passed away earlier in the year, and I had no siblings, so my mom and I lived alone in our house. The COVID lockdowns were still in place, but as certain restrictions were lifted, people were starting to return to work. Between my house and the train tracks was a stretch of empty field. It became a safe, quiet space for me to escape to whenever I needed to get out of the house. I would normally sit there once a day for a cigarette or two, sometimes for a little picnic. My home situation was complicated, to say the least, and due to the pandemic I had nowhere else to go. On this particular day, I went there for a few minutes to smoke, as always. I was about halfway through my cigarette when I noticed a young man walking along the train tracks, on the other side of the field. He was barefoot, and wearing dirty, worn-out clothes. He noticed me, and made a hand gesture suggesting that he was asking for a smoke. I should have just left, but as a teenager, I found it difficult to say no to people. I walked across the field and handed him a smoke. He took it from me and I immediately felt uneasy with the way he was looking at me. He asked me, "Don't you live in that house over there?" and pointed at my house. I avoided answering the question, and at this point realized that I needed to leave. I had left from my front gate that day. For him to know where I lived, he must have watched me leave from the back gate before. I told him I needed to get going. He started insisting on giving me a hug to say thank you, and I declined several times. At this point, I turned around and started walking away quickly. I didn't get very far. He caught up to me, and put his arm around my waist. I panicked, not knowing what to do. All I could think of was that I needed to get away. As I tried to start running, he grabbed me from behind and started dragging me toward the row of houses, where the view from the road is completely blocked. The fences were high too, so no one could see the field from their backyards. We were completely isolated. I was kicking and struggling, desperate to get out of his grasp. He ended up throwing me on the ground, with him on top of me, still holding on. In a split second, my life flashed before my eyes. That feeling that something terrible was about to happen came over me. I couldn't escape, he was too strong. My arms were trapped by his and he was holding me down, so I couldn't kick him. I did the only thing left to do and I started screaming for help. Suddenly I was free. I could move. He had let go, and jumped off of me. He ran away. My heart was still pounding. I was shaking, in shock from what had just happened.
He disappeared into the industrial area on the other side of the train tracks. I immediately ran towards the road. As I reached it, I noticed it was empty. There were no cars parked in my neighbors' driveways. No one heard me screaming, and had he realized, that day could have had a far worse ending. He knew where I lived, and I was terrified of him returning. For months, I had panic attacks and nightmares and I could barely leave my house without breaking down. I moved away from there a year later, but I still sometimes get scared when I'm home alone or walking around town. Thankfully, I never saw him again and I hope that I never will.